Evan, welcome to Real Vision.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, Ash.
It's a pleasure to have you. We were talking a little bit off camera about Ampleforth, your project. Obviously, Ampleforth is typically characterized as a stable coin, as an algorithmic stable coin. Tell us a little bit about how you view it and why you don't think that that description is necessarily the most apt.
Yeah, I would actually go ahead and say that's typically mischaracterized as a stable coin. It is. There are three categories of stablecoins that people generally think of. They think of algorithmic stablecoins, or crypto collateralized stablecoins, or dollar collateralized stablecoins. And these are kind of on a spectrum of like most decentralized and censorship resistant to least decentralized and censorship resistant. And we often get bucketed in this algorithmic stablecoin category. But the reason why I think that's a misclassification is that fundamentally the purpose of the Ampleforth protocol is not to eliminate volatility, which in the case of every other stablecoin is in fact the mission. Now, the reason why we get misclassified as a stablecoin is because the Ample has a price target. The purchasing power of one Ample is intended to always be that of one 2019 CPI adjusted dollar. But what the protocol does, rather than eliminate volatility, it translates the volatility of demand from price to quantity. So rather than the price per ample fluctuating so much, instead what you'll see is the number of amples in your wallet will increase or decrease based on demand. And so for that reason, if you were to hold ample, it'd be kind of more like holding Bitcoin. It would have this risk profile of the long run where it might 10x or 1000x, right? Or might fall in half in value. But it has this neat property where it can be used to denominate contracts like an auto loan or a car loan or some of these DeFi contracts in spite of a volatile market. So right. Our goal was to create something that's unbreakable like Bitcoin, but that is nonetheless useful as a unit of account. So really Ampleforth and the Ample as a currency is a decentralized unit of account.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating concept because most people think about the fluctuation of value in terms of price. But if value is held constant and you have the ability to programmatically mint and or burn coins to basically keep it the market capitalization compensation mechanism relative to quantity, then you can have effectively a flat price.
That's right. And that's kind of the magic of the protocol. The Ampleforth protocol allows itself really to increase or decrease the quantity of tokens in user wallets without a direct transaction between peers. So it's not as though every time we need to mint or increase the supply of Ample, we send a transaction to hundreds of thousands of wallets. And it's not the case, certainly, that when we need to decrease the supply, that we kind of reverse airdrop from people. This kind of increase and decrease in supply is governed by the adjustment of a global coefficient of expansion. You kind of think of it as a gravitational constant, even where like if you increase that constant, all the planets get closer together, decrease it, they get farther apart. That's kind of, the feel of how supply adjustments occur in the Ampleforth protocol, and they take place once per day. And I would say for that reason, it's really not a bank, right? So a bank typically has a balance sheet of assets and liabilities. It accepts kind of deposits and withdrawals. It might have this notion of like credit or debt. The Ampleforth protocol is not a bank. It's a commodity money. So think of it as a commodity like, wheat in your backyard that, if there's a good weather season, you suddenly have more of it. If there's a bad weather season, you have less of it, except for instead of weather controlling the quantity, it's actually a price exchange rate, which turns out is much more useful because it means, we could denominate a longer term contract. Like, for example, let's look at Bitcoin. Imagine 10 years ago, you decided you were going to borrow $2 million and you're going to dominate that loan in thousands of Bitcoin, right? Cut to today, right? And let's say it's a 30-year loan. You're a third of the way in and you're on the hook for billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin to pay off the rest of this loan. It'd be ludicrous to kind of think about a long-term contract that's denominated in a currency like Bitcoin or Ethereum or any floating price currency. Right. But with something like Ample, you could have denominated that contract just as it were. And in spite of the fact that the market cap of Ample has profoundly increased, you would know what your debt obligation is. You would still only be paying off $2 million over the course of however many years the mortgage is. And that gets really interesting when you start to think about the use of Ample on kind of decentralized lending protocols and some of these more DeFi platforms today.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the journey. Tell us about your background and what the need that you identified was in the space and how you came to the conclusion that this is what you wanted to spend your time investing in.
For sure. It's a really good question. So my background originally is not so much in finance or economics, but rather in engineering. So I studied mechanical engineering originally at UC Berkeley, and increasingly got more and more into computer science as I was drawn into kind of the research of robotics, but ultimately just kept leaning more towards software and got pulled into kind of this startup world afterwards. And I remember when I was first introduced to Bitcoin, this was very early on. I had only read the paper. My initial impression of it was that this is crazy. I mean, why would any technologist design a system that's so unscalable? That was the question, one question that stood out for me. And then the second question was like, why does it have a fixed supply? I just had this vague understanding that we once had this gold standard. We once had kind of Bretton Woods and, dollars that were redeemable for gold. And we went away from that. And I kind of assumed that was for a reason. And then I kind of just dismissed it as unlikely to succeed. It's too complicated, right? It doesn't scale, and I'm not sure why it's fixed supply. But in the back of my mind, I did keep turning. I eventually came to understand that, well, it's super unscalable. I mean, the designers of that protocol made huge concessions around scalability in favor of censorship resistance, right? Because there was a history of monies being shut down when they, were introduced in competition to sovereign currencies. And I remember thinking also that it was very profound that they were able to finally articulate scarcity in a purely digital context. Because, as you know, things that are on the internet are kind of default not scarce, right? You take a photo, it gets copy and pasted a million times, right? How do you create scarcity in digital context? So I understood that they succeeded in censorship resistance. They succeeded in creating scarcity. And in doing so, they succeeded in creating a digital gold, which I wasn't really that attracted to because, like, as a technologist, digital gold doesn't sound as cool as like digital cash or digital dollar, right? Digital gold just doesn't have that same appeal as it might have had for folks of a different generation. And then it wasn't until the launch of the Ethereum platform that I started to seriously think about maybe working in the space. Because I mean, that was an invitation, right, to kind of design monetary assets, to design kind of things, contracts on top of a blockchain. And around that time, me and my co-founder, Brandon, who is, he was a Google search engineer when I originally met him, working kind of on indexing, but had moved on to the Maps program at Uber. We started just kind of doing kind of weekly white paper readings. We were just trying to understand what was going on with all the kind of innovation on Ethereum. And we kept on asking, like, what are the virtues of the blockchain technology? What was it meant for? And many of the things that we saw, like utility tokens, that we're kind of thinking about these tokens as a placeholder for equity, for some sort of value capture associated with this other utility, didn't make sense. Like, how could it possibly be cheaper to design a CDN that ran on the blockchain? Like, how could it be sensible to create Uber, right, on the blockchain? It didn't make sense, but it certainly did make sense for the design of monetary assets.
Right.
And so that led us to ask the question of, like, well, what's wrong with monetary assets today? Is there anything wrong? What's wrong with Bitcoin? What's wrong with gold? What's wrong with the dollar? And those questions led us to some of our academic advisors at the Hoover Institute, which is a political and economic think tank at Stanford, Neil Ferguson and Manny Rincon-Cruz, who have been thinking about some of these questions and are part of this network of folks who have been thinking about these sorts of questions for decades. Like Milton Friedman was once at the Hoover Institute as well.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto. It's 100% free. Sign up now.